here. Start sending us your video from your streaming software. We've got an excellent connection. Just thought you all might like to know that. And how about Facebook? See what it says. Maybe it'll do it this time. Maybe it won't. Okay, looks like we're live. Excellent, wonderful, fantastic, great, awesome. Here we go. I'm going to try this again. See, I lost my feed, my internet connection on Tuesday. So we got cut off in the middle of a really good a couple of questions. So I wanted to finish up with that. So hopefully all those who watched the Tuesday night deal will check this out and see what I have to say. We had a caller, Stephen Whitsitt. He was making a point about Zechariah chapter 12, 13, and 14. And so I'll just refer you to part 1 of this. So just go back to that if you want to get all the particulars. So as I remember it, and what I wanted to address on that was this simply this idea that he was trying to put forth that Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 was literal. Or maybe it's not literal. Maybe it's figurative. See, here's the problem. When to support the futurist paradigm, in other words, that Jesus is coming in the future to rapture us all off of the planet and annihilate everything except the souls that were bad. They live forever and get tormented. In order to do that, you have no hermeneutic, period. What I mean by hermeneutic is no logical set course of interpreting or looking at the scriptures or figuring out what it says, okay? So there are certain things that we have to do when we're looking at anything. I don't care if it's the Bible or what it is, in order to understand what's being said. The very first thing you have to do is ask yourself, who is this written to? So if it's like a... Oh, I forgot to transition this. If it's like a article in a newspaper, for example, I guess the news, if there are any newspapers left, you have to take into consideration who it's being written to. Well, it's being written to a general audience, but that would be written to the people of this time. You know, what if you picked up a newspaper from 1945? It's going to be written to certain people at that time. So when we look at the Bible, this was written to certain people at that time, and they would understand the use of the language. Now, that's the very first thing that we have to do. We have to consider the context. What's the context? And usually the context is pretty clear, and I think it's very clear here in Zechariah 12, 13, and 14. Now, one of the reasons, as I recall, that our caller, why we wound up at this section in Zechariah 12, 13, and 14, was his comment that Jesus was going to literally stand on the Mount of Olives when it comes back. Well, where does it say that? He had quoted from Acts chapter 1 saying he's going to come back in exactly the same way that he left. Well, that doesn't even work for a multiplicity of reasons. We can go just look at Revelation. Is he going to come back on a horse? Is he going to have white hair, flaming fire kind of thing? Is that how it is? So which is it? Is it Acts 1 or is it Revelation or how, how do you figure all that? Well, it's because these people would have understood things. Hello, Dusty Rose, by the way. Great to see you. These people would have understood things a lot different than we do. Hi, Keith. And not understand them differently, but they would understand them in a different, coming from a different perspective, because it was their perspective. So we have to match our perspective to theirs. Now, the only way that we can do that is to try to put ourselves in the first century as closely as we possibly can. That understanding. So, Jesus quoted Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 6. In that day there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle, for it will be a unique day which is known only to the Lord. Now, I pointed this out to our caller, and he said, "Oh no, that's Jesus isn't quoting from there, as I recall. If he didn't, plenty others have. So I don't want to misquote him because I don't remember exactly. But in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36, this is where they say the transition verse is, okay? But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." So when Jesus was quoting, speaking here in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36, I believe he was quoting Zechariah chapter 14, verses 6 and 7. It will be a unique day which is known to the Lord. Now, we can read several things and we can understand, try to understand their thought processes by understanding the idioms that they used and so forth. We don't even need to know the idioms, though, to understand that this is being quoted here. But here's kind of the way this worked. Being the only feast day, the Feast of Atonement, started on the first day of the month. The Feast of Trumpets started on the first day of the month. Well, how do you know when it's the first day of the month? Well, we look on our calendars. And we say, oh, well, today's the 1st. Yesterday was the 31st. Today's the 1st. And that's how we operate. It's not how it worked. They were operating somewhat off of a lunar calendar. So they would look up in the sky at night, and as soon as they saw the horns of the crescent, that very sliver of light, they would say, oh, it's the first day of the month. Now, there's a real problem when you have cloudy days, rainy, stormy days. You're going to miss that because you can't see the moon. And it had come about that for whatever reasons, there could be fog, clouds, rain, snow, whatever. So when they didn't know when the first of the month was, if it went much past 2 or 3 days and them not being able to see it, they would just declare it the first of the month. But it had come about as a saying, only the Lord knows when this is. This is a day known only to the Lord. Well, now think about this. You might say, well, what does this have to do with the feast? It has a lot to do with the feast. Matter of fact, everything has to do with the feasts. The feasts were important. They were a sort of a preamble to the actual events that were taking place or going to take place when Messiah would come. So Jesus actually says here, now get this, in verse 36, Jesus says, of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. He's quoting Zechariah chapter 14. Now in Zechariah chapter 14, notice this. This is the message of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 24, where we're considering, okay? This is the context. It comes from not just Zechariah 12, 13, and 14, but Jesus was drawing heavily on this context without question. So let's go back here and let's look at Zechariah chapter 12, 13, and 14 and see if this is talking about 2 different days. Because our callers said, well, yeah, it's talking about 2 different days. Okay, well, let's see. Let me show you something, okay? So just get your Bible out real quick and go through this. You're going to need a paper Bible to do this. You may not be able to do it on your electronic version. You might be able to, I don't know. But here's the way this works. Look at Zechariah chapter 12, verse 1. The burden of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. So what is he talking about? This is concerning Israel. That eliminates any other time period. Israel does not exist today, nor will it ever exist again. And you're going to have to say, well, then it's spiritual Israel, and it's going to happen in the future. Really? You'll see how good that one works out for you. So anyway, this is talking about Israel. And he says, thus declares the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. What was he talking about? He was talking about there's going to come a time in the future from Zechariah and his time, being contemporary with Isaiah and Daniel, kind of. So you get this idea of the time frame. And he says, excuse me, maybe I need to Wet my whistle a little bit. He says, this is concerning Israel and Judah. Okay, this is all of the Jews. The simplest way I know how to put it. This is all of the Jews. So he says, this is what this is concerning. Well, what's concerning this? What's the following words? The rest of what he's talking about. Okay, now, so here's where this will be kind of a lightning round real quick. Look at verse 3, in that day. Verse 4, in that day. Verse 6, in that day. Verse 8, in that day. Later on in verse 8, in that day. Then in verse 9, in that day. Then in verse 11, in that day. And then chapter 13, verse 1, in that day. Verse 2, in that day. Verse 4, in that day. Chapter 14, verse 1, a day is coming. What day? Verse 4, in that day. Verse 6, in that day. Verse 8, in that day. Verse 9, in that day. Verse 13, in that day. What do you suppose he's talking about by the time he gets to verse 20? In that day. Now, if we had time tonight, we could spend, a couple hours just really tearing this apart and going through it. Of course, we don't have that time, and I'll probably fall asleep before all that happens. But, because, this is the time I got to do it, so I'm doing it. It's 11 something at night. So, what was he talking about? All these are what? 20 sometimes probably? I don't know. I didn't count. I didn't count them all. And it's in that day. And he said this is all concerning Judah, Jerusalem, Israel. Well, here's the fact. This cannot be for anything beyond the time that Israel is destroyed. Got it? It cannot be beyond any time after Jerusalem is destroyed. Because if you recall, back here in Matthew chapter 24, and I think it's verse 21, it says, "For then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." So once Jerusalem is destroyed, and our caller absolutely admits that verses 1 through 34, he posted this today on Facebook. Verses 1 through 34 in Matthew chapter 24 is all about the destruction of Jerusalem. So he admits that. He's got a real problem with 29 through 31, and he does exactly what he condemns us for and spiritualizes it. I love it. I love it. But anyway, Jesus said that once Jerusalem is destroyed and this great tribulation takes place, it will never happen again. Never happen again. Did you catch that? So when we look at Zechariah chapter 12, and it's talking about this time that the siege comes against Jerusalem, well, what's he talking about? Is he talking about the siege that took place in, 586 or whatever it was? No. What's he talking about? Let me show you. He gives us an actual time frame. So let's keep reading here. Verse 3, it will come about in that day, I'm at Zechariah 12, verse 3, that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone, for all the peoples who will lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. This is the gathering of the nations. This is what occurred in Matthew chapter 25. It's Jesus prophesying about this, and this is what occurred when the city was laid siege. The nations came against it. They might say, well, this wasn't all the nations of the earth. He's not talking about all the nations of the earth. He's talking about the Gentiles. Now, they do represent all of the nations of the earth. So when you talk about this, you're talking about these 70 nations that are outlined in Genesis 10. These were the Gentile nations. And you can go through there and you can look at this and you can study it and you can go through all of that and read all of that through Genesis chapter 10, and you're never ever going to find Israel in there. You want to know why Israel was not one of the nations in Genesis chapter 10? Because they hadn't been formed yet. Doesn't this make sense? You've got the Gentiles coming against the Jews. Now, obviously that happened with Rome. They were Gentile. But this was a whole lot more than just Rome coming against Israel. Okay, so let's keep on with this. I don't want to get too bogged down in that. So anyway, that's Matthew chapter 25. So if that's Matthew chapter 25, and most people, and our caller from back on Tuesday would have said, and I know that he says, because I read this today, I'm pretty sure I read this from him. It all kind of gets mushed together after a while, but anyway, that he would admit, and most futurists do admit, that the second half, starting in verse 36, they leave out verse 35 for some reason. Somebody did that today. They said, well, 1 through 34 is about the destruction of Jerusalem, and 36 through the end of the discourse is about the future destruction of the world. Really? If the gathering of the nations is in that day against when the siege is laid against Jerusalem, then that means the gathering of nations in Matthew chapter 25 happened in the first century. There you go. But we have more evidence. Check this out. This in that day. Now look, let's count this up. In that day, when all of the nations are gathered against Jerusalem at its siege, and Jesus said, once that happens, this siege takes place. It's never going to happen again. So all of the gathering of the nations has happened, and you've got it said, reiterated how many times? In verse 3, there's 1. Verse 4, there's 2. Verse 6, there's 3. Verse 8, there's 4. Later in verse 8, 5. Verse 9, 6. Verse 11, 7. And so just in chapter 12, 7 times it is said, in that day. What day is he talking about? He says, in that day, gives us another time statement. This is another hermeneutical principle that most of our futurist friends totally ignore, time statements. Because they want the time, sadly, to be in their lifetime. They want to be the generation. What generation has not existed that expected Jesus to come back in their time? I say there's nary a one, right? They want it to come. They want Jesus to come back in their time. And he already did. He did when he said he would. If he didn't, then we've got a serious problem. Okay. Here's another time statement. In verse 10. Just to kind of save a little bit of time. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look upon me whom they have pierced. Did you catch that? Think about this, guys. All right? Think. Put 2 and 2 together here, and try to see this as the scriptures unfold it. Right? Not the way you've been taught. Not the way the educated men, who, by the way, don't agree. Not the way they're teaching you. Not the way they try to argue it out. Just see it for the way the Holy Spirit laid it out. In chapter 12 of Zechariah, and in verse 10, I will pour out on the house of David. What's the house of David? Okay, we know what that is. And on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and of supplication. When was the Spirit poured out? It was on the day of Pentecost. First gospel sermons preached by Peter. Peter had been given in Matthew 16 the keys to the kingdom. Peter preaches on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 that this is what Joel prophesied. Okay, so we get that. Hopefully we all get that. And then he says, so that they will look upon me whom they have pierced. Wait a minute. I thought that was supposed to be something that takes place in our future. More than 2,000 years, or at 1,950 years later anyway. I thought that was something that was supposed to take place at that time. That's not what this says. We have clearly established when in that day is mentioned 7 times just in the 12th chapter of Zechariah, and it happens to Jerusalem. It happens to the Jews. It's when the nations are gathered together against Jerusalem. It's when the Spirit is poured out. This is all in the first century. There is no question that all of these events up to the point that we're talking about from Zechariah chapter 12, 1 through 10, up to this point, no question that this is all regarding the destruction of Jerusalem in Zechariah's future, which happens to be, what, 400 or 500 years later, however that works out. My math. Anyway, but it says that they will look on him whom they pierced. Wait a minute. Doesn't that sound awful familiar? Look at Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. And people want to quote this all the time, and then when I got you here. I got you here. That's how they are. Let's see. They don't have us. Revelation 1 and verse 7 says, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him." Let's go back here to Zechariah chapter 12, and what does this say? Verse 10, "So that they will look on me whom they have pierced." Okay, in the Church of Christ, the traditional teaching is, and this is very similar, the Church of Christ, and I talk about that because that's my background, right? But this is very similar to the dispensationalists and everybody else. And they think when Jesus comes back, that's what it means by every eye is going to see him. Okay, well then, if you have a round globe and Jesus comes back on one side of it, will you see him if you're on the opposite side of the globe? Or maybe Jesus would be so tall that you would see him. Because people say, well, he's physically coming back. And as our caller said, he's going to stand on the Mount of Olives. So he's going to have to be awful tall. So that wouldn't be exactly the way that he left in Acts chapter 1, by the way. Now, would it? Okay. What does this mean? Revelation 1:7 says, let me read it again. "He is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him." The ones who pierced him were still alive when he came back, as Jesus said. So they saw him. They saw these events take place. They witnessed the fulfillment of the prophecy. Now, if you think that that's not exactly right, listen to this. Let me read Revelation 1:7 again. Ready? "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. So it is to be." New American Standard. Let's go back to Zechariah chapter 12. Where are we at? Verse 10. "So that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadramimon in the plain of Megiddo. The land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of the house of David," and so on. And he names, guess what? Every tribe. Well, not every tribe, but it's represented. This is what? This is Revelation 1:7. Now, if Jesus is going to come back and every eye is going to see him, and Revelation 1:7 is a quote from Zechariah chapter 12, and Zechariah chapter 12 places the coming of the Lord and people seeing him with every eye, and then the house of Israel, Jerusalem and Judah mourning because they are witnessing it. What does that mean? Revelation 1:7, every eye will behold him or see him, is referring to. It's not referring to our time or beyond. It's referring to the time of the first century when those people were alive and they were expecting him. Boy, that just makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It makes perfect sense because you just see it there in the scriptures. That's the way the Holy Spirit put it. But this gets even better. It becomes more descriptive. Let's look at chapter 13 and in verse 1. "In that day," again, Zechariah chapter 13. And the reason we're doing this is to illustrate that when our caller said, well, this is Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 is a physical coming. It doesn't say that anywhere. Matter of fact, it makes it pretty clear that he is giving us a spiritual representation of the coming of the Lord at the time when every eye will see him in that unique day that is only known to Yahweh or only known to the Lord. But listen to this. In that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David. Now, this is the same fountain, or the same house that had the Spirit poured out on them in chapter 12. So, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for impurity. Well, what is that? This is when the gospel comes and Jesus does his messianic work and he's crucified and he ascends into heaven. Okay? It's that time period. But it's also the time period when they see him, every eye sees him, and they mourn over the one who had been pierced. And I know what they want to say. I've heard it all. They want to say, well, they did see him after he was pierced. Okay, well, you just stick with that, and we'll see how that works out by the time we get done with these 3 chapters. Chapter 13. In the day of that fountain will be opened for the house of David, for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and impurity. Follow the feasts. When was the atonement for sin made? Was that in the first 4 feasts or in the last 3? It's in the last 3. That's in the fall, those fall feasts. The Feast of Trumpets, then Atonement, and then Booths. And then you had that 8th day celebration afterwards. Now, the reason I even mention that is because that was the unique day. That the Feast of Trumpets is the only feast that begins on the first of the month. And that is the day that was only known to the Lord. That was the day they had to wait and watch for the moon to appear, so they knew when the day would, or the month would start. I apologize. My allergies have been acting up, and my throat's really dry and swollen. So you're just gonna have to bear with me a little bit over that. So there you go. That's when the fountain was going to be open. Now, I have to say this. When we see this terminology in that day, it doesn't mean one single day. It means that event. Okay, so it's in that day. That's the simplest way I know how to put that. Now, listen to this. Here's another reason that this cannot be any time in our lifetime, and it can't be anything beyond 70 and the destruction of the temple. And here's the reason why. Verse 2 of chapter 13. It will come about in that day. Has he shifted gears? Is this a different day? No, it's still the same day when the fountain is open for the house of David. When the house of David is mentioned in chapter 12, there in verse 10. It's the same concept. He's just saying it a different way, but he's giving more proof. Okay, so here we go. It will come about in that day, declares the Lord of hosts. I'm at Zechariah 13:2. That I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered, and I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. Okay? In that day, listen to this. He says, I will cut off the names of the idols from the land. That does not mean that nobody ever remembers them. It means it's done. This spiritual battle has been won. Right? This is Ephesians 6, this concept. These idols, no more. You know, you might bow down to them, but you're just bowing down to a piece of wood or metal or stone or whatever. Okay, so he cuts off the names of those idols. Many of them are forgotten in the general public's knowledge by now anyway. Or rather also. He says, I will remove the prophets. Okay, so are there any prophets around today? Some people want to say that they're a prophet, but if you're a prophet, then you're saying that or if you claim to be a prophet, and some people do. So follow this. If you claim to be a prophet today, you're saying that God and the Holy Spirit and His Son, Yeshua, did not get the job done in the first century. That's what you're saying. Zechariah chapter 13 says that in that day, when Jerusalem is laid siege, and it's destroyed, the nations come against it, when the temple falls, this is evident from Hebrews 9, by the way. When that temple falls, that's the sign that it's all done. Kaput. No more prophets. Now, let me point something out. He says the prophets and the unclean spirit will pass out of the land. Right? He will remove the prophets and the unclean spirits from the land. Then notice what he says in verse 3. And if anyone still prophesies, then his father or mother who gave birth to him shall say to him, you shall not live, for you have spoken falsely in the name of the Lord, and your father and your mother who gave birth to him shall pierce him through when he prophesies. Also it will come about in that day that the prophets will each be ashamed of his own vision when he prophesies, and they will not put on a hairy robe in order to deceive, but will say, I am not a prophet, I am a tiller of the ground. A man sold me as a slave in my youth, and one will say, what are these wounds between your arms? And then he will say, those which I was wounded of in the house of my friends. In other words, he tried to prophesy and they beat him. I guess. But he can't prophesy. He's not allowed. He couldn't do it if he wanted to. When does that take place? In that day, when the fountain is opened for the house of David, for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and for impurity. When was that? The atonement is made for sin. When was that? Or are you saying, well, that hasn't happened yet? If you believe there are still prophets today, you got a real problem. Because you're saying, well, the work wasn't complete then. And we still need revelation. We still need, no, that's not how people prophesy today. Well, then if they're not, then they're not following the biblical guidelines about it. What was the need for prophecy? To reveal God's word. What was the need for prophecy? To prove that Jesus is Messiah. If Jesus was Messiah and he completed everything that he needed to complete, then there's no need for prophecy today. Prophecy unfulfilled. Now, let's plug in a couple of factors here. I forget drink. So, you've got the unclean spirits. They've passed out of the land. Their time came. Remember, they asked Jesus, have you come to torment us before the time? And he said, you know, essentially. Kind of paraphrasing. And he cast them out into the herd of swine. They knew their time was up. In his generation, in that generation, right? He knew that. So, you've got the unclean spirits have passed out of the land. Not limited, they are destroyed. Did Jesus win the spiritual battle or not? I believe he did. That means the unclean spirits have passed out of the land. That means the prophets have stopped prophesying. Well, when did that happen? Did that happen on the cross when Jesus was crucified? No, there was still prophecy going on. We know that for a fact. When did the prophecy end? This is prescribed that in that day, that series of events, when Jerusalem is surrounded, when the siege is laid against Jerusalem, prophecy comes to an end. You cannot have John prophesying past the destruction of Jerusalem according to the scriptures. He couldn't write Revelation. If he wrote Revelation after the destruction of Jerusalem, he is in direct violation of biblical prophecy. He is no prophet, and we shouldn't listen to him. Or he wrote it, as he said, before the destruction of Jerusalem. And that those were events that were soon to take place for them in alignment with the prophetic word that we see even right here in Zechariah 12 and 13 so far. Okay, let's go to chapter 14. How much time do I have here? I told my wife, yeah, this won't be an hour. Well, honey, I was wrong. Okay, well, 34 minutes already. Granted, part of that was technical difficulties, which I seem to always have. Zechariah chapter 14. Now you tell me, have we switched another day? Have we? Let's see. Ready? Here we go. Verse 1. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. Is this the different gathering of nations than we see in chapter 12? Let me see. He is still talking about the same in that day. Got it? I mean, there's no other way to see this. Unless you simply don't want to see it. So, some people don't want to see it. Verse 2. Or, I'm sorry. Let me finish verse 2. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations when he fights on a day of battle. So you're telling me that God just handed over Jerusalem and said, well, I'm not going to fight against you. We know better than that. Now listen to this. Verse 4. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in the front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley. So you're going to have Jesus standing on the Mount of Olives with straddling a very large valley. It's an awful tall Jesus. Or maybe this isn't literal. And let me see, where did I leave off here? Verse 5. You will flee by the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Okay, so when this fleeing event takes place, and we know that they did, Jerusalem was getting ready to be sacked. The Roman army pulled away. The Christians that were in there said, here's our sign. And they hightailed it out of there. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Is there any doubt when the Lord my God will come with all the holy ones, or the angels with him? Is there any doubt about that? How far do I go with this? How much time do I take? Look here at Jude, the book of Jude. Right? Verse 14. And it was also about those that Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which the ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Wait a minute, doesn't that sound awful familiar? That you have the Lord my God coming with all his holy ones to execute judgment on these ungodly people. The ungodly people were the Jews. This was prophesied. You see, the nations, these 70 nations that were coming against the Jews for judgment on them, and God was using them for that, no question about that, were coming upon them because Israel, Jerusalem, Judah, however you want to state this, had pretty much went pagan. They were just as wicked and evil as the Gentiles, or those 70 nations. Now, those 70 nations had already been judged. They were judged at Babel. God said, listen, fine, I'm fed up with you all. Just whatever. You go worship your gods and see how well you like that. He gave them over to those gods. Now, what are you going to do with that? You're going to have to make up some other thing and really try to explain this away. To do that. Or you can just accept what it says. Now, when is that? Okay? When is it that the Lord my God will come with all his holy ones, or his angels, or so forth? When he will come with his holy ones, when is that? It's in that day that is known only to Yahweh. Isn't that Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36? Isn't that what Jesus said? Didn't he just say, go over here to Matthew chapter 24. Didn't Jesus just say in Matthew chapter 24, Let me get over here without tearing these pages out of my fragile Bible. Listen to this. Immediately, this is Matthew 24:29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. What does that sound like? The unique day that is only known to the Lord. You see, the dispensationalists get this. And they say, oh, well, this is talking about when the Lord has his final coming. Yes, I agree with them on that, only they're about 2,000 years off. At least the basic premise I agree with. But, get this! Go back. Zechariah chapter 14. Verse 5. Then the Lord my God will come with all the holy ones with him. In that day there will be no light. The luminaries will dwindle. Didn't we just read that in Matthew 24? For it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord. Didn't we just read that in Matthew 24? Neither day nor night, but it will come about at evening time. There will be light. By the way, when did they know that it was the day that was known only to the Lord? At evening time, when you could see the moon. When you saw that first light of the moon. It all fits. But notice, when is this going to take place? In that day. So how many times have we read in that day through chapters 12, 13, and 14 of Zechariah? How many times? Well, I've lost count. Probably 15 times up to this point? Something like that. Several times. And in chapter 12, we saw that in that day, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for me. So when was the Spirit poured out? We know that that happened on the day of Pentecost. On the house of David. On the Jews. Right? In chapter 13, what do we see? We see the same thing. The fountain being opened for the house of David. Salvation comes to the Jews first. Right? That's how it worked. And in chapter 14, what do we see? When the Lord comes with his holy ones on the clouds, a day that is unique and known only to the Father. When does that take place? Verse 8. In that day, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. Now, you're going to have to say, well, I guess the living waters haven't flowed out of Jerusalem yet if the Lord hasn't returned and stood on the Mount of Olives and split it in half. What he was doing was destroying that old covenant system at his return, which is exactly what Hebrews 9:28 says. Well, actually, that's when the kingdom comes. Luke chapter 21, what is that, verse 28 or something like that? That's when that happens. So, here's your point. In that day, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and the other half toward the western sea. It'll be in summer as well as winter. In other words, it's never going to stop. What are the seas that it's flowing towards? All of the Gentiles. Once the feasts are finished, we see the Gentiles celebrating with the Jews about redemption, about atonement, about forgiveness of sins. They were encouraged to come in and feast with them in that 8th day celebration from Leviticus chapter 23. It's just following that. It's following that type and that anti-type. The type, the feast. The anti-type, its fulfillment, which has already taken place. That's why we can have salvation, full and free, just like we sing in so many of our songs and preach in so many of our servants. Now check this out. Verse 9, Zechariah 14. The Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, in his name, the only one. He has won the spiritual battle. He is the only one. You'll have no other gods before me. All those guys wiped out, taken care of, remembered no more. If they haven't been, then there's still demons and there's still prophecy. You're just going to have to choose. You're just going to have to choose. One way is the right way to see it. The other way it just simply is not, according to these scriptures. Notice what this says. All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will rise on its terrain and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate as far as the place. Anyway, so it's talking about this new Jerusalem that comes about, these new inhabitants, and it will dwell in security. And they want to say, oh, well, see, this is how they physicalize everything. Well, when it suits them, they physicalize it. Say that 3 times fast. Physicalize, physicalize, physicalize. And that's what they do. They physicalize everything. Now, they say, well, Jerusalem didn't dwell in security, and there was lots of turmoil and so forth. Okay, what you're looking at is this new Jerusalem. This is the heavenly Jerusalem. This is the church. These are the people who are saved, and they dwell in security. Get it like this, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him. Who are those who believe in him? Acts chapter 2, verse 47. The Lord was adding the church daily, such as were being saved. How were they being saved? Believing on the Lord, being baptized. Okay, this is not what do you call it? Serious revelation. This is just pretty standard stuff. But that's the church. That's the new Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, and those are the ones who dwell in security. Let me see this again, because I don't want you to miss this point. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. There's the security. John 11. He who lives and believes in me shall never die. There's the security, the heavenly Jerusalem. Alrighty, where are we at? Verse 13, Zechariah 14. It will come about in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on them. They will seize one another's hand and the hand of another. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver and garments in great abundance. So also, like this plague, will the plague on the horse and the mule and the camel and the donkey and all the cattle that will be in those camps. In other words, think about it like as a battle, that the victor gains the spoils and that kind of stuff. That's the imagery that's taking place there. I know I'm not saying enough about that, but just kind of running out of time because I'm getting kind of tired. Verse 16, then it will come about in that day, now listen to this, that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the Lord. In other words, the ones who weren't judged from the Gentiles, those who are left from the nations, Genesis chapter 10, those 70 nations, those are the Gentiles. They will go up from year to year to celebrate what? The Feast of Booths. Remember what we said about the Feast of Booths? This is when Yahweh comes down to dwell with his people. You see, y'all got it backwards. Y'all got everybody being raptured up. Whether it's just a one-time thing or multiple times or it's before the tribulation, after the tribulation, so on and so forth. Yes, Mark, by the way, I am live right now. So, y'all got it backwards. It's God that comes down, not us that go up. He comes down. That's the picture of the Feast of Booths. This is Revelation 20, 21, 22. This is 1 Thessalonians 4. He comes down. You got us going up in the air, being raptured up. He comes down in the air. Look up the meaning of the word air. It's where you live and breathe. It's, 5 feet off the ground or whatever. He comes down to dwell with us. That's the picture of the Feast of Booths. Now let me read this again from Zechariah chapter 13. It will come about in that day, verse 16. Any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. The nations are now celebrating, the Gentiles are now celebrating the Feast of Booths. They become God's children. Listen to this. And it will be, whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. Is this literal? No. In other words, this is kind of symbolic of God's blessings. If you're not a part of going up and celebrating the Feast of Booths, in other words, meeting Jesus, meeting God where He has come down, that's becoming a part of the church, by the way, then you get no blessings from the Father. And you might say, oh, well, there's lots of rich Gentiles out there that hate God and they're doing great. That's not the point. So what if they live 70, 80, 90, 100 years in splendor and wealth and great health and prosperity and nothing ever goes wrong for them? They lost it all. They will perish. Let me keep reading. Verse 16, if the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague, I love this, it will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. It's a plague. You're going to die, you're going to perish. That's what the plagues were about, to prove God's point that you perish if you don't do what He says. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Now listen to this. In that day, there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. And the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the bowls before the altar. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts. And all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. And there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day. Listen to this. Your very actions of your life have holy to the Lord on it. The pots, the cooking pots, will be like the bowls before the altar. Now, think about this. You could not have the utensils. This would mean something to Jews. It doesn't mean a lot to us. But if you were a Jew and you hear this and you're going, no. You can't have a cooking pot as a temple utensil. No way. Because it has to be sanctified in order to be used in its service for the temple. Now do you get it? The Gentiles are sanctified for use in the temple, in its service to the Lord. No strangers in the house of the Lord. No Canaanites in the house of the Lord in that day. Can't be 2 days. Can't be 2 different days or multiple different days. It's that one event at the coming of Messiah at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay. Well, I said I wasn't going to do this for an hour, so I'm not. I'm going to stop just a few minutes shy of that. I want to thank you for listening. Hey, tune in each Tuesday on my Facebook page, John Watson, 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Certainly love to have you watch and share this video. I'd love to have you do that. Hit the like button and subscribe on Restoration Movement 2.0 on YouTube. That would be a wonderful thing if you would do that. And you can see these videos on YouTube. Maybe it's a little easier to get to them and watch them on YouTube than it is on Facebook. Although I've kind of based my videos off of Facebook because you can make comments on Facebook. Well, you can on YouTube too. It's just not as good. Anyway, that's it. I'm done. Hey, see you all next Tuesday. And I want you to think about this as we depart here, okay? This is all about salvation. This isn't about proving who's right about eschatology. This is about getting you in Christ so that you're not lost. The scriptures are very clear. You need to hear the truth. You need to believe it. You need to repent. You need to be baptized. You need to confess. You don't have, not necessarily all in that order. There's all this event that takes place in your heart and in your body. We see each indication of this was immediate. When they did those things, they went and washed their stripes immediately. How do you get around that? Well, you got to explain it away. But if that's what you want to do, you can be the Lord's. And that's what this is all about. This is all about proving Jesus as Messiah and simply doing what he said. And he said to do those very things. That's it. I'm done, because if I keep on going, I'll go past my hour. Then I'll break my promise to my wife. Anyway, hey, I love y'all. We will see you Tuesday. Thank you so much.